November 12, 1942. The inky waters of Ironbottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Strickland lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled not from fear, but from disbelief. Through the midnight darkness, he witnessed something that contradicted every tactical assumption of the Pacific War's first 6 months. The Japanese ships were sailing in confusion. One American destroyer, just one, had scattered an entire enemy convoy like startled birds. "They can see in the dark," whispered Lieutenant James Forrest, standing beside Strickland on the bridge of the USS O'Bannon. "We can actually see them when they can't see us." What none of them fully understood in that moment was that the deployment of a single technology would trigger the most catastrophic strategic collapse in Japanese naval doctrine, so complete that Imperial officers would later describe it as the moment they knew with absolute certainty that their advantage in the Pacific had vanished forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics of this pivotal moment were being written not in the blood of sailors but in the cold calculus of technological asymmetry. The night was not merely darkness, but had been Japan's fortress, their sanctuary in the vast Pacific, with Imperial navigators trained to fight with confidence when American ships traditionally retreated. That advantage, cultivated over decades of specialized night combat training, had evaporated in a single engagement because of rectangular boxes mounted atop American destroyer masts, the SG radar. Since the days when wooden sailing ships had first tested the waters of the Solomon Islands, naval combat had been governed by what sailors could see with their eyes and hear with their ears. In November 1942, it represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's final hope for buying time to reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal or to evacuate their starving troops from the island's jungle hell. The presence of radar-equipped Fletcher-Class destroyers would shatter that strategic calculation in less than 30 minutes of combat. The context of catastrophe had begun building months earlier. The Battle of Midway, Japan's desperate gamble to destroy American carrier forces, had ended in disaster by early June 1942. What Japanese propaganda had called a decisive Imperial victory had instead consumed the Kido Butai's core carrier strength. Approximately 3,000 Japanese casualties, 4 fleet carriers sunk, and the irreplaceable loss of veteran naval air groups had left the Imperial Combined Fleet without its striking arm. By early August, 5 American divisions were pressing toward Guadalcanal, threatening to cut off Japan's advance toward Australia. The Imperial Japanese Navy, responsible for defending the crucial sector between Rabaul and the Solomons, could muster barely 10 destroyers for nightly supply runs against a force growing with each passing day. Tokyo called these desperate missions rat transportation, a bitter irony lost on neither side. The SG radar itself carried a story that embodied American industrial might. Named after its developer at the Bell Telephone Laboratories, the Suggestion George microwave radar had moved from theoretical concept to deployed weapon system in less than 18 months. Those rectangular arrays atop American ship masts represented something the Japanese could not match: the seamless integration of scientific research, industrial production, and tactical deployment. Bell Labs engineers working under wartime pressure had constructed their system too well. The SG radar could detect a destroyer-sized vessel at 17 nautical miles in moderate seas. It displayed returns on oscilloscopes that allowed operators to distinguish between multiple targets. The original specifications called for a production run of 50 units. By November 1942, over 200 SG radars had been installed on American warships throughout the Pacific. The Japanese Navy after Pearl Harbor had been forced to adapt its traditional doctrine of decisive battle. When American carriers proved elusive, the Imperial Navy had turned to night combat as its equalizer. Since 1934, Japanese destroyers had practiced night torpedo attacks with fanatical dedication. Their long lance torpedoes, oxygen-powered weapons with ranges exceeding 20 kilometers, were designed to strike from beyond visual detection. The system was engineered for battles fought in darkness, dropping American vessels into the ocean before they could even identify their attackers. But fate and Admiral Ernest King's industrial foresight had intervened in August 1942. An American reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese destroyer squadron approaching Guadalcanal. Within hours, an engagement that would become known as the Battle of Savo Island resulted in one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. The disaster created a nightmare scenario for American officers. Send ships without radar and face catastrophic losses from unseen Japanese torpedo attacks. Withdraw entirely and abandon the Marines fighting desperately on Guadalcanal. The psychological pressure paralyzed American naval decision-making at precisely the moment when decisive action was most critical. The American response to defeat at Savo Island had been designated Operation Watchtower, a modest name for what would become one of the most consequential technological deployments of the entire war. The operation's primary objectives were to establish naval superiority around Guadalcanal and to prevent Japanese reinforcement of the island. The U.S. Navy under Vice Admiral Robert Gormley drove westward through the Solomon Islands, facing Japanese resistance that had degraded American resolve through repeated night actions. The American commanders had no illusions about stopping the Japanese Tokyo Express without technological advantage. Their orders were simply to delay, to buy time for more Fletcher-Class destroyers equipped with the new SG radar to deploy to the South Pacific. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67, nicknamed the Ironbottom Squadron because so many American ships had already been sunk in the waters off Guadalcanal, led the American defense. The night of November 12 began with stars scattered across the Pacific sky like luminous dust. Japanese command confidence had reached levels that would have been considered justified given their previous night victories. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, commander of the bombardment force responsible for the Guadalcanal sector, had departed the massive naval base at Truk on November 9 with 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers. His mission: bombard Henderson Field into oblivion, allowing the unhindered landing of 11,000 reinforcements. At 10:30 in the evening on November 12, Admiral Callahan was informed that Japanese forces had been detected approaching Guadalcanal. The radar plot from the USS Helena showed multiple contacts at ranges exceeding 15 nautical miles, far beyond what searchlights or lookouts could possibly detect. Callahan immediately dispatched his destroyers to intercept at a point 22 miles northwest of Lunga Point. The Japanese approach on November 12 had an element of accidental destiny. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Strickland commanded the USS Fletcher, the lead ship of the new class of American destroyers, armed with 5 5-inch guns, depth charges, and 10 torpedo tubes. More importantly, Fletcher carried 2 radar systems, the FC Fire Control Radar for gunnery and the revolutionary SG Surface Search Radar that could detect ships far beyond visual range. Their orders were to intercept the Japanese force before it could reach bombardment position off Henderson Field. No one on either side expected the technological imbalance that would unfold. When Strickland's radar operators reported contacts at 23,000 yards at approximately 1:25 in the morning, the sight on their oscilloscopes seemed almost surreal. Japanese warships were sailing in parade formation, running with navigation lights extinguished but completely unaware they were being tracked. Admiral Abe's flagship, the battleship High, led the formation with her 14-inch guns ready to obliterate the American airfield. The structure of Opportunity stood intact, its radar signature clearly visible on American screens while Japanese lookouts peered blindly into darkness. Lieutenant James Forrest, a 24-year-old gunnery officer who had studied electrical engineering at MIT before the war, understood the significance of what they were seeing better than most. The radar represented something far more valuable than a detection device. It represented technological supremacy, the final natural advantage overcome not by superior training or tactics, but by American scientific and industrial capacity. Rear Admiral Willis Lee, commander of the American Battleship Division who had just arrived at Guadalcanal, grasped the strategic implications immediately. This was not merely an opportunity to win a tactical engagement, but a chance to vault the entire Pacific War forward by months. Lee made the decision that would define his naval career: we're hitting them now while they can't see us. The Japanese defenders were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. Admiral Abe had arrived with his powerful force just after midnight, exhausted from the long voyage south and confident in Japanese night fighting superiority. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the destroyer Amatsukes, briefed him in minutes. The American force was believed to be still in Ironbottom Sound, unaware of the approaching bombardment group. A defensive perimeter of destroyers screened the capital ships as they prepared for their firing run. The moonless night that had blanketed the Solomon Islands had created the perfect conditions for Japanese operations, or so they believed. At approximately 1:41 in the morning, American fire control radars locked onto the lead Japanese ships. The time for deliberation had ended. The engagement that naval historians would later call the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal began with an eerie silence. American gun directors, linked to their radars, had calculated firing solutions for targets invisible to the human eye. Lieutenant Commander Strickland gave the order that would define the future of naval warfare: commence firing using radar control only. The American destroyers opened fire from 12,000 yards, nearly 6 miles away, in complete darkness. The Japanese ships, sailing confidently toward their objective, suddenly found themselves illuminated by muzzle flashes and under accurate fire from an enemy they couldn't see. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese lookouts reported American ships appearing from nowhere, when in reality, the Americans had been tracking them for nearly 20 minutes. The assault on the Japanese force took less than 40 minutes. Lieutenant James Grimble's fire control team aboard the USS San Francisco, operating the new Mark IV radar fire control system, led the American barrage. The system was so new that most Japanese officers had never considered its implications in combat. Armed with the ability to track targets through darkness and rain, they represented yet another symbol of American technological supremacy. The American ships fired star shells to create artificial daylight and hammered Japanese positions with radar-directed salvos. The heavy cruiser Nagara, watching the American targeting from her position near the Japanese formation center, knew the moment had arrived when shells began landing with uncanny accuracy around her position. Captain Kaju Sugiura, watching the American fire control from his bridge, gave the order to make smoke and increase speed. At 2:23, Admiral Abe gave the order to reverse course. The decision created chaos in the Japanese formation. Destroyers turned to deploy torpedoes while capital ships attempted to withdraw. The Japanese doctrine of night fighting, practiced for years with meticulous attention to detail, collapsed in minutes against an enemy who could see through darkness. Major Takeo Maeda, watching from the bridge of the battleship Kurashima, faced the most consequential decision any Japanese officer would make that day. The battle formation was broken. The American fire was coming from multiple directions with inexplicable accuracy. Every instinct, every principle of Imperial naval doctrine demanded he launch long-lance torpedoes immediately. But Admiral Abe approached him minutes earlier with a desperate question. How were the Americans seeing them? What technology could possibly allow such precision in total darkness? Maeda had no answer. The decision would cost him his life. Captain Torajiro Sato, the torpedo officer aboard Kurashima, positioned himself at the torpedo director in anticipation of the order to fire. When Maeda finally received the order from Admiral Abe at approximately 2:30, with American ships clearly gaining tactical advantage, Sato began the launch sequence. The Japanese torpedoes, technological marvels in their own right, streaked through the water toward where they believed American ships might be. But the Americans, tracking Japanese movements by radar, had already changed course. Not a single torpedo found its target. Lieutenant Raymond Stickle, a 31-year-old radar operator from San Diego, California, became the first American sailor to track and successfully avoid enemy torpedoes using radar returns of the torpedo wakes themselves. Behind him, Forrest and the rest of the CIC team kept tracking multiple targets, directing American fire with a precision that seemed supernatural to the Japanese. Engineer Lieutenant Paul Donaldson and his team began systematically exploiting every contact they could find on their radar screens, racing to direct fire before Japanese captains could determine what was happening. Seaman First Class Arthur Richter, a radar technician who had learned electronics at a trade school in Chicago, made continuous adjustments to the SG radar to maintain optimal tracking through rain squalls. The explosion that followed at approximately 2:47 sent shock waves through the Japanese formation. The destroyer Akatsuki, hit by multiple 5-inch shells from Fletcher and O'Bannon, erupted in flames visible for miles. The destroyers Akazuchi and Inazuma were struck repeatedly by radar-directed fire. American ships, invisible in the darkness, poured devastating salvos into targets they could see only as luminous blips on their radar screens. Aboard High, Admiral Abe watched in stunned silence as his formation disintegrated. His flagship had been hit multiple times. Communication with several destroyers had been lost. Most critically, the bombardment mission, the entire purpose of risking his capital ships, was now impossible. At 3:15 in the morning, he gave the order that would echo through Imperial Navy history: all ships withdraw northward. The immediate aftermath was chaos controlled by Japanese training and determination. Admiral Abe's shattered force began retreating north toward Rabaul, working frantically to assess damage and rescue survivors from sinking destroyers. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet began establishing a defensive perimeter at Shortland Island, expecting American pursuit that never materialized. Japanese resistance collapsed with stunning rapidity. The battleship High, severely damaged by American gunfire and unable to maintain formation speed, was abandoned and scuttled the following day. By 10:30 in the morning, Admiral Yamamoto at Truk received the devastating report: the bombardment had failed. American ships had somehow detected the Japanese force in complete darkness and fired with unprecedented accuracy. 4 destroyers had been lost. 1 battleship was sinking. Over 1,000 Japanese sailors were dead, with hundreds more wounded. News of the engagement traveled up the Japanese chain of command with the speed of a tsunami. By approximately 11 o'clock, Admiral Yamamoto radioed his fleet commanders with words that were terse and fatalistic: "The Americans have a new weapon. We must reassess night operations." Yamamoto immediately relayed the information to Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo. Admiral Osami Nagano was conferring with his staff when the call came through. According to witnesses, Nagano stared at the report in disbelief. Within minutes, he was on a secure line with Naval Minister Shigetaro Shimada. "How could they see our ships?" Nagano asked, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "In complete darkness, in rain squalls, they fired as if it were daylight." Shimada's response became legendary among the Japanese high command: "If they can see in darkness, our advantage is gone. This changes everything." Admiral Yamamoto immediately called his chief of intelligence at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk. "Find out what technology the Americans are using," he ordered. "Nothing else matters now." The Japanese reaction was a study in command paralysis and technological desperation. When news reached Emperor Hirohito at his palace in Tokyo, his response combined strategic despair with cold calculation. Hirohito had been clinging to increasingly tenuous hopes that Japan's night fighting superiority would buy time for the overextended empire to solidify its defensive perimeter. The entire Japanese naval strategy in the South Pacific hinged on using darkness as an equalizer against superior American numbers. An American technological advantage that negated this superiority demolished that strategy. Hirohito's immediate response was to demand answers. He summoned Admiral Nagano to the Imperial Palace on November 15. The conversation that followed would reshape Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What is this American device?" Hirohito asked, his normally quiet voice edged with concern. "We believe it is a form of radio detection equipment, Your Majesty," Nagano replied. "Our technical experts call it Denpa Tanchiki, electrical wave detection machine. The Americans call it radar." "How advanced is our own research in this area?" the Emperor inquired. Nagano's silence spoke volumes. Japan had rudimentary radar systems in development but nothing deployed on combat vessels. The technological gap represented years of research and production capacity Japan simply did not possess. The psychological impact extended beyond words. Japanese naval officers, who had maintained absolute faith in their night fighting superiority, now understood that a fundamental pillar of their combat doctrine had crumbled. The implications rippled through every strategic calculation. The technological assessment was brutally honest. Captain Toshikazu Ami, an intelligence officer assigned to analyze the battle, later provided the most candid Japanese assessment of the radar's impact. When we realized the Americans could direct accurate gunfire in complete darkness, we knew immediately what it meant. Our years of night battle training had been negated by American science. Naval attaches in Berlin were ordered to obtain German radar technology immediately. Research laboratories in Tokyo received emergency funding. But the gap could not be closed with Japan's limited electronics industry. The failure to anticipate and match American radar development symbolized a deeper strategic blindness, the inability to recognize that modern naval warfare had become as dependent on technology as on training and spirit. For Japanese officers trained in the Bushido tradition of warrior excellence, this technological defeat cut deeper than any tactical loss. It was not merely a setback but a moral shock, proof that the spirit-focused Imperial Navy that had dominated the Western Pacific in 1941 had encountered a material and scientific superiority it could not overcome. While Japanese officers were processing the implications of their defeat, American forces were exploiting their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Within 24 hours of the engagement, Admiral Halsey had ordered all available Fletcher-Class destroyers to Guadalcanal. Radar training became the highest priority for ships deploying to the South Pacific. Every ship captain was briefed on the new tactical reality: the Japanese night fighting advantage had been neutralized. The strategic calculations were inescapable. With American radar allowing accurate night combat, the Japanese Tokyo Express supply runs to Guadalcanal became suicide missions. Every Japanese convoy that approached the island would be detected at ranges that made surprise impossible. The Imperial Navy's carefully cultivated night fighting superiority, which had been Japan's primary naval advantage, had been rendered obsolete in a single engagement. Captain Edward Stafford, the operations officer for Admiral Halsey's South Pacific Force, later provided the most concise American assessment of the radar's strategic impact. The SG radar allowed us to see at night what previously only the Japanese could see. It equalized the playing field in one stroke and then tilted it decisively in our favor. Admiral Nimitz, when briefed on the engagement's details, grasped the implications immediately. "This changes our entire Pacific strategy," he told his staff on November 18. "If we can fight at night as effectively as day, the Japanese cannot reinforce or supply any island garrison we choose to isolate." The human cost of the technological revolution provides another measure of its significance. Japanese casualties in the naval battle of Guadalcanal totaled approximately 1,900 killed with hundreds wounded and the total loss of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 3 destroyers over 3 nights of fighting. American losses, while substantial at 650 killed and 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers damaged or sunk, reflected a completely different trajectory. The Japanese losses were irreplaceable, the American losses represented temporary setbacks in a rapidly expanding fleet. The disparity reflected the fundamental imbalance of technological capabilities. The Americans had radar, radar-directed gunfire, and the industrial base to deploy both in increasing numbers. The Japanese had training, determination, and torpedoes that were becoming increasingly ineffective against an enemy who could detect and avoid them. The growing certainty among Japanese officers that their technological inferiority would determine the war's outcome cast a dark shadow over the Navy's future operations. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who would later command Japanese naval forces at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, summarized the new reality in a report to Combined Fleet Headquarters: "If the Americans can see us and we cannot see them, all advantages of training and tactics are negated. We have encountered an enemy whose scientific capability has outpaced our own. This single factor may determine the outcome of the naval war." The final assessment of radar's significance must include its role in the Allied strategic debate about how to prosecute the war in the Pacific. Before the naval battle of Guadalcanal, there had been serious discussion about whether to pursue a cautious island-by-island approach or to adopt General MacArthur's more aggressive Southwest Pacific strategy. Some American and British planners argued that forcing direct naval engagements would be costly and that blockade and aerial bombardment could accomplish similar objectives with less naval loss of life. The radar revolution made that debate irrelevant. With American warships now capable of fighting effectively day and night, halting the advance made no strategic sense. The momentum must be accelerated. The rapid shift in naval tactics from November 1942 onward vindicated that decision. American ships deliberately sought night engagements where once they had avoided them. Japanese convoys found themselves under attack at all hours, with no sanctuary in darkness. By December 1942, just 1 month after radar's decisive introduction at Guadalcanal, Admiral Nimitz had authorized a complete revision of Pacific Fleet tactical doctrine. The new manual, classified top secret, contained an entire section devoted to radar-controlled naval gunfire. The shift in strategic thinking was seismic. Where previously American commanders had avoided night combat whenever possible, they now actively sought it, knowing their technological advantage was greatest in darkness. The radar-equipped Fletcher-Class destroyers became the spearhead of this new approach. The ships, which had initially been designed as fleet escorts and submarine hunters, were now employed as aggressive night fighters. Task groups centered around radar-equipped ships began systematically hunting Japanese convoys throughout the Solomon Islands chain. The hunting strategy was devastatingly effective. On the night of December 11, 1942, the destroyer USS Grayson detected a Japanese supply convoy approaching Munda Point with her SG radar. The 5-ship Japanese formation was sailing without escort, believing the night would provide adequate protection. At a range of 16,000 yards, nearly 8 miles, in complete darkness, American gunfire opened up on targets the Japanese could not even see. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Japanese sailors began calling American destroyers ghost ships that could strike from invisible positions. The Japanese High Command, stunned by the sudden reversal of their night fighting advantage, scrambled to develop countermeasures. Emergency orders went out to all Japanese ships in the South Pacific: avoid night operations wherever possible, sail only during daylight hours when American air power presented the primary threat. The order represented a complete inversion of Japanese naval doctrine that had been built over decades. From 1943 onward, Japanese naval officers would describe their tactical situation as fighting blind against an enemy that could see in darkness. The radar gap transformed the fundamental nature of the Pacific War at sea. The technological revolution rippled through the highest levels of Japanese strategic planning. On December 15, 1942, Emperor Hirohito convened an emergency meeting of the Imperial War Council. The agenda contained a single item: American radar technology and its implications for Japan's defensive perimeter. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the naval minister, delivered a brutally honest assessment. The Americans can now detect our ships at ranges exceeding 15 nautical miles in total darkness, Shimada reported. Their fire control systems can direct accurate gunfire using these radar returns. We have no comparable capability, nor can we develop one in less than 2 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had promised the emperor that Japan's technical prowess would overcome American industrial advantages, stared at the table. General Hideki Tojo, who served as both Prime Minister and Army Minister, finally broke the silence. "What can we do to neutralize this American advantage?" he asked. Admiral Shimada's response was frank to the point of insubordination. "Nothing, in the immediate term. We cannot match their radar technology quickly. Our only option is to adapt our tactics to this new reality." The strategic implications cascaded through Japanese planning. The Solomon Islands campaign, which had hinged on Japan's ability to reinforce Guadalcanal at night, was fundamentally compromised. The Central Pacific defensive perimeter, which required naval mobility between island garrisons, was suddenly vulnerable. The entire concept of an imperial defensive shield had been penetrated not by superior numbers or tactics, but by a technology that Japan had failed to prioritize. The human dimension of this technological disparity played out in the lives of sailors on both sides. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Strickland of the USS Fletcher received the Navy Cross for his role in the naval battle of Guadalcanal, but his citation mentioned nothing about radar. The technology remained highly classified even as its effects transformed the war. When interviewed after the war, Strickland reflected on the psychological impact of radar's introduction. The Japanese had built their entire naval doctrine around superior night fighting capability. When we suddenly nullified that advantage, we broke something fundamental in their strategic confidence. It wasn't just that we could see them, it was that they realized we would always be one step ahead technologically for the remainder of the war. Aboard the destroyer Yukikase, one of the few Japanese ships to survive the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Captain Masao Tanaka wrote in his war diary, "We trained for years to master night combat. We conditioned our eyes, developed tactics, built superior torpedoes, all rendered meaningless by an American device we cannot counter. It is as if a swordsman who has spent his life perfecting his art suddenly faces an opponent with a rifle." The technological shock rippled through the Japanese naval establishment. Admiral Matomagaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, recorded in his diary on November 20, 1942, "The Americans have overcome our night fighting advantage through scientific means rather than training or spirit. This is the most concerning development of the war thus far. If they can neutralize our tactical specialties through technology, what other surprises await us?" The answer would come with devastating clarity in the months ahead. American technological advantages multiplied as the war progressed. Proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells appeared in 1943, allowing American warships to create defensive barriers of exploding shells that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate. Fire control computers became increasingly sophisticated, allowing faster and more accurate targeting. But it was radar that transformed the fundamental balance of the Pacific War. By early 1943, every American warship of destroyer size or larger carried some form of radar. The technology had evolved from a detection device to the central nervous system of American naval operations. Combat information centers became the heart of American warships, darkened rooms where radar operators tracked every contact within miles of the ship. The technological gap widened rather than narrowed as the war progressed. Japanese efforts to develop comparable radar systems suffered from limited electronics manufacturing capability and a lack of scientific resources. The few Japanese radar sets deployed to combat vessels were primitive compared to American systems, with shorter ranges and poor resolution. The human cost of this technological disparity grew with each passing month. Japanese losses in night engagements from November 1942 through August 1943 exceeded 50 warships and over 12,000 sailors. American losses in the same period, while significant, represented less than a third of Japanese casualties. The disparity reflected not differences in courage or training, but a fundamental technological imbalance that shaped every engagement. Japanese naval officers, trained in the Bushido tradition that emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage, struggled to adapt to this new reality. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most successful destroyer commanders, later wrote, "We had built our naval doctrine on the belief that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. American radar forced us to confront the limits of that philosophy. No amount of courage or training could compensate for fighting blind against an enemy who could see through darkness." The Japanese Navy attempted desperate countermeasures. Ships were painted with radar-absorbing materials. Decoy vessels were deployed to confuse American radar operators. Japanese naval intelligence offered enormous rewards for the capture of intact American radar equipment. None of these measures proved effective against a technology that continued to evolve faster than Japan could respond. By March 1943, just 4 months after radar's decisive debut at Guadalcanal, American naval doctrine had been completely transformed. Radar-equipped task groups actively sought night engagements, knowing that darkness multiplied their advantage rather than limiting it. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, which had numbered just 20 in the Pacific in late 1942, grew to over 60 ships by mid-1943. Each carried the latest SG radar, each represented a weapons system the Japanese could not effectively counter. The human dimension of this technological revolution extended beyond tactics to morale. American sailors gained confidence knowing they possessed capabilities their enemies lacked. Japanese sailors increasingly viewed night operations as potential suicide missions. The psychological balance shifted as dramatically as the tactical balance. Vice Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commander of Japanese destroyer forces in the Solomon Islands, captured this psychological impact in a report to Tokyo in April 1943. Our sailors now fear the night because they know American ships can strike without warning from beyond visual range. This fear affects performance more than any material shortage. We can replace ships and weapons, but we cannot replace fighting spirit once it has been broken by technological inferiority. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual engagements. The entire Japanese defensive perimeter in the Pacific depended on the ability to move troops and supplies between island garrisons at night, when American air power was neutralized. With radar-equipped ships now hunting these convoys around the clock, the garrisons became increasingly isolated. Starvation and disease began taking a greater toll than combat in many Japanese island bases. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most respected naval strategist, recognized the existential threat that radar posed to Japan's entire war plan. In February 1943, he convened a conference of senior naval commanders at Truk. The discussion focused almost exclusively on countermeasures to American radar. The conference produced no viable solutions, only an acknowledgement that Japan had fallen critically behind in a technology race it could not win. 2 months later, Yamamoto himself would fall victim to American technological superiority. American signals intelligence intercepted and decoded messages revealing his inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. American P-38 fighters, guided by precise timing and navigation, intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft and shot it down over Bougainville on April 18, 1943. The loss of Japan's naval leader represented another blow to an already faltering war effort. The radar revolution accelerated the development of American naval tactics in ways no one had anticipated before the war. By mid-1943, American destroyers were conducting what they called radar picket operations, stationing ships equipped with the latest radar systems at strategic points to provide early warning of Japanese movements. These pickets created an electronic screen that allowed American forces to detect and track Japanese ships and aircraft long before they could threaten American task forces. The Japanese, operating without comparable capabilities, were effectively fighting blind against an opponent who could see through darkness, rain, and smoke. The tactical disadvantage became increasingly insurmountable as the war progressed. Japanese commanders found themselves outmaneuvered in engagement after engagement, not because American officers were inherently more skilled, but because they possessed information the Japanese could not access. The human toll of this technological disparity was measured in thousands of lives lost. In the naval battle of Vella Gulf on August 6, 1943, American destroyers detected a Japanese destroyer squadron with radar at a range of 11 miles in complete darkness. The American ships maneuvered to cross the Japanese formations T, the classic naval tactic that allowed maximum firepower against minimal enemy guns. When the engagement began, the Americans had already achieved a decisive tactical advantage before firing a single shot. The resulting battle lasted less than an hour. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk with over 1,500 sailors lost. Not a single American ship was damaged. The Japanese survivors reported being taken completely by surprise, with American shells striking their ships before they even knew enemy vessels were present. The psychological impact on Japanese naval morale was devastating. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who would later command Japanese naval forces at Leyte Gulf, described the situation in a confidential assessment sent to Tokyo in September 1943. "We are fighting an enemy who can see us when we cannot see them. This fundamental disadvantage cannot be overcome by tactics or spirit alone. Until we develop comparable technology, we must acknowledge that naval operations in the South Pacific carry unprecedented risks." The technological disparity extended beyond tactical engagements to strategic intelligence. American radar picket destroyers detected Japanese naval movements days before planned operations, allowing American commanders to position their forces optimally. The Japanese, lacking comparable capabilities, operated in an information vacuum, never certain whether American forces were tracking their movements. This intelligence asymmetry contributed to Japan's accelerating cycle of defeats from late 1943 onward. Operations that depended on surprise were compromised before they began. Defensive preparations were countered by American forces that seemed to anticipate Japanese moves with uncanny accuracy. The cumulative effect was a progressive collapse of Japanese strategic cohesion. By the beginning of 1944, the technological gap had widened even further. American radar systems had evolved through multiple generations while Japanese capabilities remained rudimentary. The latest American radars could detect fighter-sized aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles and distinguish between different classes of ships based on their radar returns. Japanese systems, when they were available at all, offered ranges of 20 to 30 miles at best and poor resolution. The human consequences of this gap played out in the battles of 1944, as American forces began the inexorable advance toward Japan itself. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, radar-directed combat air patrols decimated Japanese carrier aircraft in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training due to fuel shortages and accelerated preparation, found themselves detected and intercepted long before they could reach American carriers. The battle resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers and the loss of over 600 aircraft, losses Japan could not replace. American losses totaled 123 aircraft and 0 ships. The disparity reflected not just industrial capacity but the fundamental technological advantage that radar provided to every aspect of American operations. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japanese carrier forces at the Philippine Sea, offered a stark assessment in his after-action report. The Americans detected our aircraft at ranges that made surprise attacks impossible. Their fighter direction using radar gave them perfect positioning for interception. We lost not because our pilots lacked courage, but because they were fighting an enemy with superior information. The technological revolution that had begun at Guadalcanal in November 1942 reached its culmination in the battles of 1944 and 1945. By the time American forces approached the Japanese home islands, radar had transformed from a revolutionary technology to the standard foundation of naval operations. Every American warship, from massive battleships to small patrol craft, relied on radar as its primary sensor system. The Japanese, still struggling to deploy even basic radar systems across their fleet, found themselves fighting an increasingly hopeless battle against an enemy that could detect, track, and target them under any conditions. The technological disparity that radar had introduced became symbolic of the wider industrial and scientific gap between the two nations, a gap that grew wider rather than narrower as the war progressed. The human dimension of this story extends beyond the war itself to the lessons it taught both victor and vanquished. For American military planners, radar's success reinforced the critical importance of technological superiority. The post-war American military would place unprecedented emphasis on research and development, seeking to maintain the technological edge that had proven so decisive in the Pacific. For Japanese military analysts, the radar gap represented a painful lesson in the dangers of technological complacency. Japan had entered the war believing that fighting spirit and superior training could overcome material disadvantages. The radar revolution demonstrated the limits of that philosophy in modern warfare. Post-war Japanese defense policy would place heavy emphasis on technological advancement, seeking to ensure that Japan would never again find itself fighting blind against a technologically superior opponent. The radar revolution's legacy extends to modern naval operations. Today's warships, with their sophisticated electronic warfare systems and networked sensors, are the direct descendants of those first radar-equipped destroyers that transformed naval warfare off Guadalcanal. The principle that information advantage translates directly to combat advantage remains central to naval doctrine worldwide. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Strickland never considered himself a revolutionary. When interviewed decades after the war, he described his actions at Guadalcanal with characteristic modesty: "We were just using the tools we had as effectively as we could." None of us realized at the time that we were changing the fundamental nature of naval warfare. Yet that is precisely what Strickland and his fellow radar pioneers accomplished. By exploiting a technological advantage that their opponents could not counter, they transformed the Pacific War from a contest of evenly matched adversaries to an increasingly one-sided demonstration of American technological superiority. The Japanese night fighting advantage, carefully cultivated over decades, evaporated in a single engagement against ships equipped with technology that could see through darkness. The radar revolution reminds us that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor, shaped by human decisions about which technologies to prioritize and how to employ them. The American decision to invest heavily in radar development before and during the war reflected a recognition that technology could multiply combat effectiveness beyond what training alone could achieve. The Japanese failure to make comparable investments reflected a different philosophy that ultimately proved inadequate against an opponent who could literally see what they could not. In the final analysis, radar's introduction to naval warfare in the Pacific represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how technology can transform the fundamental balance of military power. The Japanese, who had entered the war with justified confidence in their naval capabilities, found themselves rendered tactically obsolete by a technology they had failed to prioritize. The radar gap became emblematic of the wider industrial and scientific disparity that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. Yet we must remember that behind the technology were the men who employed it, the radar operators who learned to distinguish between different types of contacts on their oscilloscope screens, the officers who developed new tactics to exploit radar's capabilities, the sailors who fought with new confidence knowing they could detect their enemies long before being detected themselves. Technology provided the advantage, but human skill and courage determined how effectively that advantage was employed. The radar revolution that began at Guadalcanal in November 1942 represents more than a tactical innovation or a technical achievement. It stands as a powerful reminder that in warfare, as in all human endeavors, the future belongs to those who can see farther, literally and figuratively, than their opponents. The American ability to see through darkness changed not just the course of battles but the course of the war itself, hastening Japan's defeat and saving countless lives that would have been lost in a more protracted conflict. As we reflect on this technological turning point, we are reminded that innovation is not merely a matter of scientific discovery but of recognizing which technologies will prove decisive in conflict and investing accordingly. The radar gap between America and Japan was not inevitable, it represented the consequence of different priorities, different industrial capabilities, and different visions of how future wars would be fought. The lesson resonates across time: technological advantage is perishable, requiring constant investment and innovation to maintain. Today's military planners, facing a world of rapid technological change, would do well to remember the lesson of those radar-equipped destroyers that changed the course of the Pacific War. The ability to see what your opponent cannot, whether literally through sensors or figuratively through superior intelligence and analysis, remains the most fundamental advantage in warfare and in life. For the Japanese officers who witnessed their carefully constructed naval doctrine collapse in the face of American radar, the lesson was painful but clear: no amount of training, tradition, or fighting spirit can fully compensate for fundamental technological disadvantage. The radar gap represented not just a tactical setback but a philosophical challenge to Japan's entire approach to warfare and national defense. The radar revolution reminds us that history's turning points often arrive not with dramatic declarations or heroic last stands, but with the quiet introduction of technologies that transform the rules of the game. The SG radar, with its unassuming appearance and technical complexity, changed the Pacific War more fundamentally than many battles involving thousands of men. It serves as a reminder that in war, as in all competitive human endeavors, seeing what others cannot see often makes the difference between victory and defeat. The final assessment of radar's impact on the Pacific War must include its role in both accelerating the Allied advance and fundamentally reshaping naval doctrine worldwide. By early 1944, the technological gap had become so pronounced that Japanese naval officers began referring to radar as the American magic, a capability that seemed to border on the supernatural in its effects. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, whose destroyer forces had suffered devastating losses to radar-guided American ships, captured this sentiment in a post-war interview: "We entered the war believing that superior training, fighting spirit, and night combat tactics would overcome American material advantages. Radar rendered those beliefs obsolete overnight. Our sailors were not less brave or less skilled, they were simply fighting blind against an enemy that could see through darkness. The psychological impact of this technological disparity extended far beyond tactical engagements. It penetrated to the heart of Japanese strategic thinking, forcing a painful reassessment of the fundamental assumptions that had guided Imperial Navy doctrine for decades. The belief that spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages, a cornerstone of Japanese military philosophy since the Meiji era, collapsed in the face of American radar superiority. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who served as chief of the Naval General Staff's Operations Division during this critical period, later reflected, the radar gap exposed a deeper philosophical flaw in our approach to modern warfare. We had convinced ourselves that the warrior spirit of Bushido could compensate for technological inferiority. Radar demonstrated the limits of that belief more clearly than any other factor in the Pacific War. This psychological dimension of technological warfare has often been overlooked in traditional military histories, which tend to focus on material factors and battlefield outcomes. Yet for the Japanese naval officers who experienced it firsthand, the radar revolution represented not just a tactical disadvantage but a profound crisis of confidence that affected every aspect of naval operations. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and later served as a staff officer in the combined fleet, described this crisis in stark terms during post-war interrogations. After we realized the capabilities of American radar, a form of fatalism began to spread through the officer corps. When your enemy can see you but you cannot see him, there is a sense of helplessness that corrodes morale and initiative. Even our most aggressive commanders became hesitant, knowing they were operating at a fundamental disadvantage. The technological imbalance created by radar had strategic implications that extended far beyond individual engagements. By mid-1944, American submarine warfare against Japanese merchant shipping had reached devastating effectiveness, aided significantly by radar that allowed submarines to detect and track convoys on the surface at night. Japanese anti-submarine efforts were handicapped by the lack of comparable detection systems, allowing American submarines to operate with increasing impunity. Commander Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb, one of the most successful American submarine captains of the war, later credited radar as the single most important technological advantage in his submarine's operations. With our SD radar, we could detect Japanese convoys at ranges of 15 to 20 miles on clear nights. We could track them, maneuver into attack position, and launch torpedoes while remaining completely undetected. The Japanese had no comparable capability, which meant they were essentially fighting blind against an enemy they couldn't see. The human cost of this technological disparity was staggering. By the end of 1944, American submarines had sunk over 600 Japanese merchant vessels totaling more than 2.7 million tons. The Imperial Japanese Navy, lacking effective countermeasures against radar-equipped submarines, watched helplessly as its merchant marine was systematically destroyed and its home islands cut off from the resources of their conquered territories. Admiral Takeo Kurita, who commanded Japanese naval forces at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, provided perhaps the most poignant assessment of radar's strategic impact in his post-war memoirs. By 1944, we were fighting not just against American ships and planes, but against American science. Their radar systems allowed them to detect, track, and destroy our forces with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to our sailors. We had no answer to this technology, and this fact alone made our defeat inevitable. The radar revolution transformed the fundamental character of naval warfare more profoundly than perhaps any other technology introduced during World War II. Before radar, naval combat had been conducted primarily through visual means, with lookouts straining their eyes through binoculars and ships maneuvering based on what their crews could physically see. After radar's introduction, naval warfare became increasingly electronic, with combat decisions based on information gathered by sensors rather than human observation alone. This transformation had profound implications for naval architecture, crew training, command structures, and tactical doctrine. Ships designed before radar became rapidly obsolete, not because of their armament or protection, but because they lacked the electronic infrastructure to support modern sensor systems. Naval officers trained in pre-radar tactics found themselves struggling to adapt to warfare conducted through oscilloscope screens and electronic plotting tables. Commander Thomas Dyer, who served as a radar officer aboard USS South Dakota, captured this transformation in his post-war reflections. Radar changed not just how we fought, but how we thought about naval warfare. Before radar, the captain on the bridge made tactical decisions based on what he could see with his own eyes. After radar, the Combat Information Center became the brain of the ship, with decisions made based on electronic information that no human eye could detect. It was a revolution not just in technology, but in the very concept of command and control. This revolution extended beyond hardware to the human dimension of warfare. Radar operators, many of them young sailors with technical aptitude rather than traditional naval training, suddenly became critical to the success of naval operations. Their ability to interpret the ghostly green blips on oscilloscope screens could determine the outcome of engagements involving thousands of men and billions of dollars of equipment. Lieutenant Raymond Stickle, who served as a radar operator aboard USS Fletcher during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, described this responsibility in a 1985 interview. "We were typically just kids in our late teens or early 20s, many of us with no formal electronics training. Yet suddenly we found ourselves responsible for detecting threats that could sink our ship and kill our shipmates. The pressure was intense, but so was the sense of purpose. We knew we were the ship's eyes in the darkness, and everyone depended on us to see what no human eye could detect." The radar operators developed a unique culture and terminology, referring to their equipment with nicknames and developing an almost mystical connection with their systems. They spoke of getting the feel of their radar sets, of learning to distinguish between different types of contacts based on subtle variations in the electronic returns that no manual could adequately describe. This tacit knowledge, passed from experienced operators to newcomers, became as important as the technology itself. Chief Petty Officer Arthur Richter, who trained radar operators for Fletcher-Class destroyers, explained this human dimension in post-war lectures to the Naval War College. The radar equipment was only as good as the men operating it. We could install identical radar sets on two different ships, and one would consistently outperform the other. The difference was in the operators, their attention to detail, their ability to interpret ambiguous returns, their intuitive understanding of the system's capabilities and limitations. This human factor in technological warfare offers a critical insight often overlooked in discussions of military innovation. Technology alone does not determine battlefield outcomes, rather, it is the integration of technology with human skill, training, and doctrine that creates decisive advantage. The American success with radar stemmed not just from having superior equipment, but from developing the organizational structures, training programs, and tactical doctrines that allowed that equipment to be employed effectively. Vice Admiral Willis Lee, commander of American battleship forces in the South Pacific, recognized this principle early in the radar revolution. In a December 1942 memorandum to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, he wrote, "The radar equipment is only the first step. Equally important are the combat information centers where radar data is processed, the communication systems that distribute this information, and the tactical doctrine that guides how commanders use this information. We must develop all these elements simultaneously if we are to fully exploit our technological advantage." Lee's insight proved prescient. The Americans systematically developed each component of the radar combat system, the technology itself, the organizational structures to process radar information, the communication systems to distribute it, and the tactical doctrine to employ it. The Japanese, scrambling to catch up technologically, never developed the supporting infrastructure that would have allowed even limited radar capabilities to be employed effectively. This comprehensive approach to technological innovation offers lessons that extend far beyond the specific context of World War II naval warfare. It suggests that technological advantage alone is not sufficient, rather, it is the integration of technology into broader organizational and doctrinal frameworks that creates decisive military advantage. The radar revolution accelerated as American forces approached the Japanese home islands in 1945. By the war's final months, American radar capabilities had evolved far beyond simple detection to include target identification, electronic countermeasures, and integrated fire control systems. The Japanese, still struggling to deploy even basic radar systems across their fleet, found the technological gap widening rather than narrowing as the war progressed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, captured this exponential progression in a March 1945 assessment for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our radar advantage increases with each month of the war. What began as a tactical edge in night fighting has become a comprehensive superiority that shapes every aspect of naval operations. The Japanese cannot match this capability, and this fact alone may shorten the war by many months. Nimitz's assessment proved accurate. The radar advantage contributed significantly to the accelerating pace of American victories in 1945, as Japanese forces found themselves detected, tracked, and destroyed with increasing efficiency. By the war's final months, American carrier task forces operated with near impunity off the Japanese coast, protected by an electronic shield of radar-equipped picket ships that detected incoming attacks long before they could threaten the main force. The human toll of this technological disparity grew increasingly one-sided as the war progressed. Japanese kamikaze attacks, desperate measures born of technological inferiority, were detected by radar pickets and intercepted by combat air patrols guided by fighter direction officers using radar data. While these suicide attacks occasionally penetrated American defenses, their effectiveness was drastically reduced by the early warning that radar provided. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace of the war with 34 aerial victories, credited radar with much of his success. Our radar operators would vector us to intercepts that would have been impossible using visual methods alone. We could climb to optimal altitude, position ourselves for attack, and engage enemy aircraft before they even knew we were in the area. It was like having a third eye that could see through clouds, darkness, and distance. This asymmetric advantage extended to every domain of naval warfare. American submarines, equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems, hunted Japanese shipping with devastating effectiveness. American amphibious forces, protected by radar-equipped support ships, landed on island after island with decreasing casualties. American battleships conducted shore bombardments guided by radar fire control systems that achieved unprecedented accuracy. The cumulative effect was a progressive collapse of Japanese naval capabilities that accelerated beyond what conventional analysis would have predicted. It was not merely that American forces were winning battles, they were winning them with decreasing cost and increasing efficiency, creating a dynamic where Japanese losses accelerated while American losses declined. Admiral Somu Toyota, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, captured this dynamic in his final report to Imperial headquarters in July 1945. We are not merely being defeated, we are being systematically dismantled by an opponent who can see what we cannot, strike where we cannot defend, and anticipate our movements before we make them. This technological disparity has created a situation where traditional concepts of naval parity no longer apply. The radar revolution's impact extended beyond military outcomes to the psychological dimension of the conflict. American sailors, confident in their technological superiority, approached engagements with increasing boldness. Japanese sailors, aware of their disadvantage, operated under a cloud of fatalism that affected everything from tactical decision-making to basic morale. Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens, executive officer of USS Nicholas during the final months of the war, recalled this psychological dimension in a 1980 oral history. By 1945, you could sense a fundamental difference in how we and the Japanese approached combat. We operated with the confidence of knowing we could detect them before they could detect us. They operated with the hesitation of knowing they were fighting blind against an opponent who could see through darkness. That psychological edge was as important as any technological advantage. This psychological dimension had strategic implications that transcended individual engagements. Japanese naval planners, aware of their technological inferiority, increasingly avoided direct confrontation with American forces. This strategic hesitation allowed American operations to proceed with decreasing resistance, accelerating the collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later organize the kamikaze forces, acknowledged this psychological impact in a February 1945 assessment for Imperial headquarters. the knowledge that American ships can detect us at ranges where we cannot detect them has created a form of defensive paralysis among our commanders. Even our most aggressive officers hesitate to engage when they know they are fighting with a fundamental disadvantage. This hesitation has strategic consequences more severe than any material shortage. The radar revolution reached its culmination in the final months of the war, as American forces established a naval blockade of Japan that leveraged radar technology to achieve unprecedented effectiveness. Radar-equipped aircraft and surface ships systematically eliminated Japan's remaining merchant marine, cutting the home islands off from the resources they desperately needed to continue the war. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet during the war's final campaigns, assessed this culminating impact in his post-war reflections. Radar transformed naval blockade from a porous barrier that resourceful opponents could penetrate to an almost impermeable shield through which nothing could pass undetected. This transformation alone may have shortened the war by months or years by accelerating the economic collapse of Japan. The human cost of this transformation is difficult to calculate precisely, but military historians have estimated that the radar advantage may have saved tens of thousands of American lives by accelerating Japan's defeat and eliminating the need for a protracted blockade or invasion of the Japanese home islands. For the Japanese, the radar gap contributed to a more rapid defeat that, while devastating to national pride, ultimately reduced the total suffering that a prolonged conflict would have inflicted. The radar revolution's legacy extends far beyond the specific context of World War II. It fundamentally transformed naval warfare from a primarily visual medium to an electronic domain where sensors and countermeasures determine outcomes more decisively than traditional factors like gun caliber or armor thickness. Modern naval warfare, with its emphasis on electronic warfare, stealth technology, and over-the-horizon targeting, is the direct descendant of the revolution that began with those first SG radars at Guadalcanal. Captain Wayne Hughes, a naval strategist and historian, captured this enduring impact in his seminal work on naval tactics. The introduction of radar in World War II represented the single most significant transformation in the character of naval warfare since the transition from sail to steam. It changed not just how navies fight, but how they think about fighting. Every aspect of modern naval operations, from ship design to tactical doctrine to strategic planning, bears the imprint of this revolution. This transformation extends beyond military applications to the broader relationship between technology and human affairs. The radar revolution demonstrated how technological innovation can create asymmetric advantages that reshape the balance of power more fundamentally than traditional metrics of military strength. It suggests that in modern conflict, the ability to see what others cannot, whether literally through sensors or figuratively through intelligence and analysis, often proves more decisive than conventional measures of military power. This lesson has implications that extend into the present day, as military planners worldwide grapple with emerging technologies that may create similar asymmetric advantages. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic weapons, and cyber capabilities all have the potential to create disparities comparable to the radar gap of World War II, situations where one side can operate with information and capabilities that the other cannot match. The radar story reminds us that such advantages are rarely permanent, but can prove decisive if exploited during the window of opportunity they provide. The Americans maintained their radar advantage throughout the Pacific War not just because of their initial technological lead, but because they continued to innovate more rapidly than their opponents, widening rather than narrowing the capability gap as the conflict progressed. This dynamic of accelerating advantage offers a powerful lesson for contemporary strategic thinking. Technological superiority is not a static condition but a dynamic process that requires continuous innovation and adaptation. The side that recognizes this principle and builds organizational structures that facilitate rapid technological evolution will enjoy advantages comparable to those the Americans derived from radar in the Pacific War. As we reflect on this technological turning point, we are reminded that the ultimate impact of innovation depends not just on the technology itself, but on how effectively it is integrated into broader organizational and doctrinal frameworks. The Americans succeeded with radar not just because they had better equipment, but because they developed the training programs, organizational structures, and tactical doctrines that allowed that equipment to be employed effectively. This comprehensive approach to innovation offers lessons that extend far beyond military applications to any field where technological change creates opportunities for transformative advantage. It suggests that successful innovation requires attention not just to the technology itself, but to the human systems that employ it, the training, organization, doctrine, and culture that determine how effectively new capabilities are translated into practical outcomes. The radar revolution reminds us that in warfare, as in all competitive human endeavors, seeing what others cannot see often makes the difference between victory and defeat. The ability to detect, analyze, and act upon information that remains invisible to your opponent creates advantages that transcend traditional metrics of power and capability. This principle remains as relevant today as it was when those first Fletcher-Class destroyers detected Japanese ships in the darkness off Guadalcanal. In an era of accelerating technological change, the lesson of radar's decisive impact on the Pacific War offers a powerful reminder that the future, in war as in peace, belongs to those who can see farther, literally and figuratively, than their opponents. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.